Uh, I I'm quite aware that I'm addressing a somewhat heterogeneous audience, so I'm trying to both say something quite general about Plato and the Republic, that it is accessible to all my listeners, but I cannot resist. I have my own interpretation, which I will offer you. So I think, as Samka said, it's a wonderful text, the Republic. I think that we should assess it, we should evaluate it for what it is. Let me say a few words about how I see Plato. Okay, I think of Plato as an aristocratic radical. In other words, he's an innovator, but at the same time he leans towards the traditional ways of viewing politics. In my mind, he tries to steer clear of the two extremes, the traditional model, which is in his view represented by the poets, and that's how I understand his criticism of poetry. I think his criticism of poetry is really a criticism of tradition and a criticism of the way in which tradition has been handed down. And on the other hand, he is critical of sophists who are quite aware of the limitations of the traditional view, but in Plato's view, they go too far. So in a sense, Plato is a utopian if we make the distinction between two senses of utopianism. One is the sort of what I call pie in the sky utopianism, which has nothing to do with anything that is real. I think Plato's utopianism is the utopianism which says that there are certain necessary features about human beings and about human societies, and based on that, let us give a picture of how this could be performing at their best. So that's is based in reality, but is very far from the way it exists today. Okay, so I think that Plato is certainly a communitarian. He is a rational, he's an advocate of rational freedom, but occasionally I think there are offensively authoritarian and even totalitarian whiffs in the Republic. I think there are two major interpretations in the last few decades, two major interpretations of Plato. One is the Popperian interpretation, which sees the Republic as kind of a proto-fascist, proto-Nazi document, totalitarian document. And then on the other hand, there is the Straussian interpretation, which said, well, the Republic is basically an ironic document showing that philosophy is not really compatible with politics. I reject both these interpretations, but I also agree with both interpretations. On the one hand, I think Popper, if we focus on books 5 to 7, there is reason to think that there are whiffs of totalitarian, authoritarian, and even proto-fascist elements in it. And I think Strauss is right that if we are concentrating on books 6 and 7 of the Republic, then we see that philosophy as it is portrayed in those books as pure philosophy, that pure philosophy is indeed incompatible with politics. And indeed, I think one of the injustices of Plato's advocacy of politics, that it's overly rational, overly pure philosophical. I think there are two republics, and I think there are two conceptions of philosophy, and there are two conceptions of politics in this book. And that's why when I teach the Republic to people in political science or in politics, I usually avoid books 6 and 7, because those are books really more about philosophy than they are about politics. I don't today, I'm not going to spend much time about book 5. I think that there are a lot of problems with it, but there is a long tradition. It's not a dominant tradition that sees the origins of the republic in what's called a proto-republic. And according to this interpretation, which I share, the proto-republic, which really consists of books 2 to 4, more or less, was already on Plato's plate in the mid-90s, soon after Socrates' execution, before his first trip to Sicily. We can talk about his trips to Sicily and how it affected his writings on politics. But I adhere to what's called the fragmentarian approach to the republic. I believe that the republic was on Plato's desks all his life, and it didn't reach its final form, the one we have till the end of his life. And it is a composite. It's an ingeniously worked together composite. And the composite pieces are as follows. I think book 1 had a very different form initially. It was one of the first, and I think some people suggest that it was called Thrasymachus. And it was later rewritten, adapted to fit the rest of the Republic. And I think that the characters of Cephalus and Polemarchus in the book 1 are later editions. I think the integrity of book 1 is the debate between Thrasymachus and Socrates. And in many ways, it lays down the theme of the whole Republic, which is about power, which is about two senses of power. In Latin, these two senses are called potentio and potestas. Potentio is power in action, is internal power, is the power of autonomy. Potestas is power over, okay? And as Thrasymachus sees power, for him, power is only power over. And that's why he believes that justice is in the interest of those who have power over others. Now, I think it's never made very clear, but there is this distinction throughout the Republic, which comes out in book 4, more important, of this conflict between inner power and external power. And as justice, that's why Plato's so-called definition of justice is so strange, because he describes justice as a form of inner power. And there was a few decades ago an article by David Sachs who says there's a fallacy in Plato's Republics, and the fallacy, according to Sachs, is that Plato doesn't really answer the question, the question is, how do people who have this inner power, this internal power, autonomy, rational freedom, are they just in an ordinary sense? How is the connection between being just internally, which is the balance of your soul, and just externally to others? And I think it's a question. There are some areas in the Republic where there's some answers often, but I think basically Plato wants to shift the discussion about power away from power over, potestas, towards power within. Now, so let me say a few words here. So I think book 1, as it's been rewritten, fits very well with book 4. And it's interesting that the two characters, which I think were added later, Cephalus and Polemarchus, represent the two types of individuals that are described in book 4, because in book 4, if you recall, there are 3 types. There's the appetitive, people who are sated by their appetites, physical desires. The spirited type, people who are motivated by their notion of honor, victory, fortitude, steadfastness. And then there's the power of those who want to see things as a whole, reason. So there's these 3 types according to Plato, and all human individuals have these characteristic traits to different degrees, and that's what determines whether you are a reasonable type, a spirited type, or an appetitive type. And I think that Cephalus is the appetitive type. I mean, he's the businessman who's very comfortable with his body all his life. He was a decent, not very spirited, not very intellectual individual. On the other hand, his son, Polemarchus, I think stands for the spirited type. He also represents the heroic ancient notion of justice, competitive notion of justice. And I think that the Thrasymachus and Socrates in book one stand for the reasonable types. I mean, they're both reasonable, they use their reason in different ways. So, okay, so that's book one and book four are linked that way. I'm gonna say much more about book four later on. And then I wanna jump to books 8 and 9. I think book 8 and 9, as the dialogue at the end of book four, Socrates says, well, now we've described the best regime, we described what virtue is. Let's now describe the worst regime, the decline from the best regime and the individual. And I think that too has to be seen in terms of the three types of regimes and the three types of individuals. Okay, the kingly regime, the kingly type corresponds to the reasonable type. The democratic regime, the democratic type corresponds to the spirited. And then there's the three others. I mean, it's interesting because there's the oligarchic type, the democratic type, and the tyrannical type. Now, these are all aberrations to different degrees of the appetitive type, okay? Throughout the Republic, when Plato talks about the third type of individual, sometimes he calls it the appetitive, sometimes he calls it the money-making. And his justification for this shift is that, well, the moneymaker wants to accumulate money to satisfy his desires better. But in any case, in book 8, these three degenerate types are the degraded versions of the appetitive type. The oligarchic type accumulates. He's basically the most reason of the appetitive type. We could think of it today as the businessman who's not really much interested in physical pleasures. He's interested in accumulating wealth. The second type, the democratic degenerate, is what we understand, the libertine, sort of whose desires are in a chaos all over indifferently. And then the last one, the tyrannical type, is the individual for whom one of the desires oppresses the whole soul of the individual. And it's interesting that for Plato, this is the sexual drive that seems to make an individual tyrannical. Now, let me very quickly turn to book 4. I mean, book 4 is set up already in book 2 when, if you recall, or those of us who read book 2, the beginning of book 2 is kind of a recap of the Thrasymachus position. And Glaucon, one of the two young aristocrats, says, well, it's all very nice, Socrates. We would all like to be just, but in a society such as we have, it's very difficult to be just. So could you please show us who are individuals more or less intelligent, more or less decent, we have more or less power, how we could be just in this unjust world. And I think the so-called city-soul analogy, the most powerful element of this analogy, is precisely to see the interrelationship between justice in the city and justice in the individual. And I believe that Plato would agree that unless you're a divine soul, a special individual, you're not going to be able to be just in a rotten world. In order to survive, you have to commit acts of injustice. So in other words, to be just, to have a full autonomy over yourself, to have a full balance of your soul, you need to strive to make your environment, your city, that is also balanced. And how is a city balanced? Now, I'm going to introduce a whole bunch of terminology. There are, in the book 4, there are 3 parts of the soul, okay, the reasonable, the passionate, spirited, and the appetitive, okay. I would prefer to call them three different inclinations, dispositions. And I can defend this, I mean, not all the way, but I think it's a reasonable way of looking at human nature. Also, I think Plato has this wonderful insight that the human soul, the human psyche is like a political structure. And that's why the analogy works so well, because he says, well, we want to look at justice. It's best to look at justice on a larger scale, because there is clear that justice in a city is a political question. And I want to show you that justice within the individual is also a political question, because within the individual, there are these three dispositions, he calls them parts, which are in tension with one another. And whether an individual is an autonomous, powerful, just individual depends on how he's able to manage, he's able to manage this potential tension. Now, of course, I mentioned that since the soul, the individual soul, is a structure in dominance, all individuals, all human beings, all souls have these three different parts, these different dispositions to different degrees. For some, one dominates, for others, other dominates. Now, let me turn to the city. The city has three functions. It's very clear that there's the economic function, the productive function, producing the means of a material existence. There's the preservation, defense, preserving the tradition, preserving the territory, and that there's the deliberative function, which is the legislative and ruling function. And there are three types of individuals. There's the one whose main dominant character trait is having a pleasant life of material survival. And these, according to Plato, this is a larger group in a society, and they should have their family, they should have within certain limits property, they should have certain amount of luxury within limits. He's extreme, and that's why Cephalus in book 1 is very interesting, because it's very generous towards Cephalus. The description of Cephalus is, I think, also the description of what we call the third type. These are decent people, and as long as we provide for them the sources of their happiness, let nature take care of the rest, Plato would say. And then there's the spirited types, people who are much more interested. The spirited types, I also think, are more conservative in a sense that they preserve not just the territory, but they preserve the institutions and they preserve the tradition of the city. The wise, the reasonable type, they're more innovative, they're more critical. And when I talk about book 8 and 9, I want to talk about the tension, the potential tension within different classes in a city. But I will come to that later. So I have introduced the three types, the three functions, and the three groups. Okay, and often I think there's misinterpretations of Plato. One misinterpretation is that according to Plato, only the philosophers can be just. I think it's false. I think according to Plato, everyone can be just, but some people can be just in a more secure way than other people. In other words, a person whose main character trait is learning and doing philosophy is more likely to be just than the person whose main character trait is acquiring goods. They're more vulnerable, in other words. So in other words, just all individuals can be just in the same sense, but their security is different. Okay, so that's one thing. One of my claims, that every individual can be just in the same sense, but in different degrees, different ways. Some people reproach Plato for his somewhat strict class division. I could read a passage, but I don't have the time. We don't have the time. It's 434 AB, where he says, well, if a cobbler does the work of a carpenter, it's not so bad. So he says, when I'm talking about people not meddling, people doing what is suited to their nature, I'm not talking about small things like that, but I'm talking about big things. And he says, and he's very strict in this. And I agree with him. I mean, being a relapsed Marxist myself, I agree with Plato says, the economic class should never be allowed to rule. The military class should never be allowed to rule. Only the deliberative class, the one who is least interested in potestas, power, external power, should rule. And I think this is correct. And I think even today, it's something that we have to keep in mind. That there's four virtues. There's three types and four virtues. The four virtues are wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. Now, wisdom is typically the virtue of the deliberative class, the reasonable class. Courage is typically the virtue of the passionate, spirited class. And moderation is typically the virtue of the appetitive, the desiring class, okay? Once again, Plato believes in the unity of virtues. In other words, to have one virtue is to have it all, to have it all. In other words, the courageous person must have some wisdom, otherwise he's foolhardy. The appetitive person must also have some wisdom, otherwise he is a pig. And I would say that the reasonable person must also have some restraint. The virtue of the reasonable person is not to be too obsessed with rationality, rationalism. And I once again, I think that one of the examples we could use, I associate the three types. Fascism is the evil of the spirited type. Communism is the evil of the reasonable, rational type. And capitalism is the evil of the appetitive type. In other words, these are, you could think of it, these degenerate forms. So reason, think about the communist regimes, think about the planned economy, the command economy. And of course, that was the Achilles heel of communist regime. They were overly rationalistic, and they're very different from fascist regime. And people can understand, because fascist regimes it wasn't reason that undid them as communist regime. It was their passion. It was their passion of the tradition, etc. Okay. So there are these virtues. There's some problems here, you see, and I need to solve some of the problem. And in order to solve that problem, I've introduced already distinctions, but I want to introduce the last distinction. I want to introduce a distinction between determination, domination, and rule. And this is again in Plato. Plato says that the appetitive type is the strongest and most dominant, I didn't say dominant, the most determinant in all individuals and in all societies. In other words, he says the economic factor is the most important determinant factor. Now, whether it's determinant doesn't mean that it's also dominant, okay? Because you could have a society in which the economic type is the most numerous, which is the case in all society. But the question is, under what condition would a different type of society and a different type of individual be just? And I think Plato's answer to that is that for an individual to be just or to be virtuous in any sense, his soul needs to be ruled by his reason. In other words, You see, it doesn't mean that I'm a reasonable type. I may be a spirited type, but unless my dominant characteristic is not ruled by reason, I slip off. I become foolhardy. I become crazy. Same. So in a sense, there's the rule. All virtuous individuals, their reason must rule. It doesn't mean that they're all wise in the fullest sense. Different individuals have different dominant character traits, and all individuals have their desire, appetites as the determining factor. Now, listen, I'm going to leave it at this. He also says that justice, it's interesting because the three virtues correspond to the three types: wisdom, courage, moderation. Justice, he often says, is the source of all the virtues. And he defines justice, as I mentioned, as a form of non-meddling, as a form of never overpowering the other aspects of your soul. In other words, not allowing your appetite to dominate you, not allowing your spirit, and even not allowing your reason to dominate yourself. Now, I want to just conclude by going to book 8 and 9. Book 8 and 9, which, as I said, is the discussion of the degenerate, okay, the decline of from the best to the worst, okay. You know, one of my favorite philosophers says that the best approach to the history of philosophy is not to parrot or idolize what the philosopher says, but to try and find out what the philosopher should have said, but couldn't say and didn't say, because it was innovators usually cannot the right expression to express their own view. But a true historian and philosopher should say what the great historical figures should have said, but didn't say. And that's what I'm trying to say about book 8 and 9, okay? Because I think if we take the Platonic view that the source of decline is internal to even the best, I think a democratic regime, which is a regime, is a military regime, basically, a military where the military rules. A democratic regime comes into power precisely because a large number of the individual defenders find that the rulers are too revolutionary, too innovative. They're too much caught in their own reasonableness, and that's why they take over. And I think that happens even in more modern cases. And then the democratic regime to Plato give degenerate into the oligarchic regime. I mean, that also is my naive view, that military power depends on economic wealth. And I think that the way democratic regimes become oligarchic regimes is because the need to provide the economic resources for the military tend to dominate than the military purposes of society. And then the oligarchic, as he says, the oligarchic regime is one where the production of wealth is dominant. And this production of wealth also produces poverty. And once the society is able to produce enough wealth so that most people can at least to some extent satisfy their desire, there's a chaos of desire, this absolute libertarianism. And once you have this absolute libertarianism, an authoritative figure or an authoritative power, an authoritative character trait begins to overpower the others. So in a sense, Plato is very clever because he sees democracy as we would call populism, and it's not really populism is not a law-like democracy. In other words, in populism, it's the people, it's not the constitution, it's not the law that dominates, that rules. And for that reason, eventually there is this turn towards an authoritarian figure, a dictator, a tyrant. And that's, I think, how Plato sees it. Plato sees it. So in summary, I think that's all I have to say. I emphasized Plato on justice. And I think that his emphasis is on internal justice rather than external justice. And I think that's the justification he has basically for using this city soul analogy, because he sees the soul of an individual as a political structure, if you wish, a dynamic. And in that sense, I think his psychology is somewhat conservative, but also somewhat progressive, because he sees the human soul, the human subject, as a dynamic process. I think sometimes he becomes too conservative, believing that once a certain character trait dominates, it will stay like that forever. I would believe that it's a little bit more fluid than he seems to think. But I like the idea of conceiving the human soul as a political structure, as a dynamic parallelogram of forces, if you wish. Anyways, I'm going to stop there, and I hope that I said enough to at least provoke some questions, and I hope that I'll be able to answer your questions.
Thank you, Béla. Thank you for kind of a deep into the universe of the book, The Republic, and not taking it as a kind of a sacred cow, and that's very important.
Exactly. That to me is my approach. I'm very intolerant towards what I call the Plato idolatry. You know, there are some Plato scholars who think that the moment you start criticizing Plato for anything, you just reveal your ignorance, because Plato is the truth, the whole truth, the pure truth, and the absolute. And this is the Straussian, Bloomian, I think, idolatry. And that's why I turn away from that approach.
Okay. So please, anyone who is in the picture or just listens, please introduce yourself and then please pose the question or clarification, because don't hesitate to ask for clarification even of things that you think that you should know, because
exactly.
there's a likelihood that other people wouldn't know. For example, could you tell what is democracy? Because if you didn't read the book, just start.
Well, democracy, the Greek word is thumos, which has to do with spiritedness, and democracy is really literally the rule of spirit. In other words, democracy is rule of the spirit, the type, which is to say, rule of the type that values victory and valor and honor, the soldierly type, basically, the martial. It's kind of a martial regime, the democracy. We could call it a military dictatorship. Does that answer your question, Samko?
Yeah, absolutely. So go ahead. Anyone, any question on the subjects or something that Béla Egyed mentioned that kind of strike you as strange, or that you might agree, disagree. Don't worry. Béla has no difficulties with things that are not his.
I mean, I think that what we have to keep in mind, and especially you, is that debate is encouraged and debate is possible about Plato and about how people interpret Plato, including my interpretation. There's no sacred Plato and there's no sacred interpretation of Plato. I mean, I could go into some of the intricacies of that, you know, but let's just leave it for that.
Nicola, are you?
Yeah, I was
Please.
just figuring out how to raise my hand, but
Anybody just turn on the speaker and then speak.
okay. So right, so my name is Nicola. I'm a first year at BISLA right now, and I was wondering because you mentioned that if I understood it correctly, you mentioned that justice of the city is different from what justice is of the soul, and I
No,
was
it's not different. No, absolutely. I think the argument of the Republic is that the justice in the city is justice exactly in the same sense as it is justice in the soul. And that's why his strategy in book 2, he says, let's first look at the state. Let's first look at the city. Let's find out what it is to be, for a city to be just, okay? And once we have found that using that model, we could figure out what is just in an individual, you see? And a city is just if it's ruled by the best, if it's ruled by reason. A city is just if its tradition are defended by courageous people, etc. So he wants to move. Anyways, that's I think that's what I meant to say.
But Nicola, you wanted to pose another question, right?
No, I was just trying to clarify because in the sense that if it was, well, since I didn't understand it correctly, I was thinking, my question was going to be, how can a city be just if justice for people is different from what is justice for the city? But now it makes sense. So,
well, listen, I think you shouldn't give up because it is a question. I mean, some of the critics of the Republic raise precisely that question, I think Plato could be ultimately defended, but it's possible in a just city to have unjust individuals. In other words, for me, a just city is one in which anyone that chooses to become just can become just. In other words, in a just city, there are no obstacles to being justice. I think a just city doesn't mean that everybody is going to be just. And also in an unjust city, there are just people. And in book 2, Adeimantus says, well, Socrates, don't talk to us about these people. We know that there are these godly spirits who could be just, who are saintly, who are just in any rotten city, any rotten situation, you see. So there's that, it's not an absolute parallel. It's more, anyway. Does that help? Okay.
Okay, so may I ask, I'm Tomáš. I wanted to ask about that. You just mentioned that there is a just city and an unjust city. Like, could you clarify what a just city means for Plato? Because
yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
like you expressed like what just city means, like broadly, that an individual can turn to be just.
Can I answer that as 1 and 2? What is a just city? What's your question? As a very important question. A just city, according to Plato, is where these 3 different functions, remember the economic, defensive, productive functions, are in harmony with one another, okay? He also at one point says, in a just city, we do not want to have too much wealth and we do not want to have too much property. In other words, it's a just city strikes a proper balance, a proper measure. And also the different groups who are groupings of different types of people coexist with one another harmoniously. And I think I want to put my emphasis on autonomy, justice as autonomy, as power. He says, even though people are different, they can be autonomous. They could be free on their own terms. And he says, what is really a source of injustice is when people do not act in accordance with their own nature. And so if there's a message, maybe it's a conservative message, but Plato says that in a just city, the different types of people act in accordance with who they are. They pursue the the vocations that is most suited to that. And I think if you want to go to the individual now has these three character traits, okay? And an individual, all individuals have them to different degree. Now you find out if you are interested in being the most free and autonomous person, you find out who you really are. Plato would say, who am I? If I'm basically an appetitive type who finds his greatest pleasure in satisfying, do that, but do it moderately, do it modestly. Don't try to become a soldier, you know, don't try, no, just because somebody tells you that that's the best thing to be, that's not you. And if you're going to try to be something that you're not naturally, you're going to be a disaster. You're going to be unhappy, you see? Same for philosophy.
So like, is that in some sense a defense of slavery also, or like, does that mean that
you see, he does say that freedom, unrestrained freedom, okay, which some people today would call negative freedom, can be a form of slavery. You're a slave to certain, slave to certain notions, certain ideas, certain passions, okay? So he is contrasting freedom, which is rational freedom, autonomy, okay? And you see, for Plato, I would make justice, freedom, autonomy, power, virtue. These are all the same. These all hang together. You are powerful to the extent that you have command over yourself. You understand who you are. You act in accordance with what you really are, and you don't try to be something other than what you are. Does that make sense to you?
Tomasz, did you mean the slavery as is often understood slavery, whether Plato defends slavery of man or human being over human being? Did you mean that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so then I didn't understand, but that's a very important question, and it has to be really emphasized. Aristotle believes in slavery, and Aristotle's views on slavery actually are pretty shitty, because on the one hand he says, well, there's natural slavery, but then he realizes that there are slaves who've been captured in war, which are not necessarily natural slaves as he understands it. But Plato does not anywhere in a republic advocate slavery. There are no slaves, and that in a sense makes Plato's view far superior to Aristotle, because we praise Aristotle for his democracy, that all the citizens participate in politics. Yes, for Aristotle, all the citizens participate because they have slaves, because they do the shitty work, you know, so they can be gentlemen citizens who preoccupy themselves with politics. That's Aristotle, but that's not Plato. I mean, the strangeness in Plato is that for Plato, there are no slaves, but there are these third type of people who would do gladly within restraint, productive labor, and would reap the fruits of that labor. And contrary to the leaders of society who are not allowed to have property, not allowed to have luxury items, they do.
If you don't mind, can I ask Phil Azzi to kind of have a few words on this? The Aristotle defense of slavery, Plato not even talking about. Is there any notion that you would tell us, Phil, on this?
Top of mind reaction. I don't disagree with anything Béla just said. Clearly, I think there's no use pussyfooting around. There is a justification of natural slavery in Aristotle. The only question I would raise, I think, or the question that should be raised, and I think Aristotle does allude to it, is who is this natural slave? And, you know, he gives his basic definition is basically someone who's a gentle beast, someone who does not have the capacity to rule themselves. Now, who might that be today? You know, but you could give any number of examples or try to find someone who would correspond to that. Basically, someone who needs someone else to take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
Béla's right. In Aristotle's case, you know, this person is the one who is going to do the shitty work. It's basically someone who is a domesticated animal. But, you know, the question is, you know, Aristotle gives that definition, and then I think it's incumbent upon us to ask, is there actually anyone we know who corresponds to this, who is so incapable of taking care of themselves?
Exactly. And if I may say something, I think that if we want to go one step further, I think it shows a superiority of Plato's position over Aristotle's, because Aristotle has a very naive, I think, limited notion of the self. For him, there's the animal self, and then there's the reasonable self. And the animal types are natural slaves, and the reasonable types are natural citizens. Now, you see, for Plato, it's much more subtle. And that to me is interesting, because for Plato, there are no animal individuals, because all individuals have reason to some extent. All individuals have passion to some extent, sense of shame, but not developed to the fullest degree. So I think the Platonic individual is a much more complex individual than the Aristotelian individual. And that, I think, spills over to their view of the working class. You see, the working class for Plato is the working type is an honorable type and can be very just and well-adjusted and free type, whereas there isn't that correspond in Aristotle. I mean, Plato sometimes towards the end of the book talks about metal workers, and he has in mind miners who are almost bestialized. You know, he sort of sometimes flirts with that Aristotelian notion. But I think if you focus on what he says in book 4 about these 3 types, I think you have a more complex view of the human individual than Aristotle. Anyway.
Well, no, actually, Béla, I was going to ask you, it kind of ties into what I wanted to ask you. You began earlier by saying, I think, that Plato believed in the unity of virtue. And then I understood that to a certain extent. And later you mentioned different character types. That may not have been your actual language, but, you know, not trying to be something you're not. So my question is simply, to what extent ultimately, or could you talk a little bit more about the unity of virtue in Plato? Because my initial reaction was, I don't know that there is unity to virtue in Plato, in the sense that precisely there are different character types. There are people who are particularly spirited and not particularly thoughtful, people who are particularly thoughtful and not particularly considerate, people who are particularly considerate or compassionate and not particularly courageous.
Yeah, no, but I agree with that, Phil, but having agreed with that, can I say this, that you're not really courageous unless you're also wise to a little extent and moderate to a little extent, because if you are not those, you're foolhardy, you're reckless. And similarly, if you are an appetitive type, okay, sure, the moderation is your typical virtue, but to be moderate requires a little bit of rule of reason, is about a little bit of rule of shame, okay? So in other words, to be fully virtuous, moderate virtuous, you have to have all those, because if your reason isn't ruling you, you cannot be moderate. So even though wisdom is not your typical character trait, there must be some trace of wisdom in all of us, just as there must be some trace of justice in all of us, you see? But maybe there's more controversies to this notion of the unity of virtues. I don't see it as presenting great difficulties.
No, I was thinking very basically, Béla, simply in terms of, a person who somehow embodies all the virtues, right? They're very intelligent or thoughtful. They're very compassionate and just. They're very courageous. That was my only point, that that's kind of a rare individual. We all tend to be more inclined in one direction or another.
Yeah, I think, but you see, being moderate for a wise person is very easy because he doesn't have the kind of problems with his desires that the desiring person has. That's why moderation, I think you could be much more proud of being moderate as a third type of individual than as a first type of individual, because to be moderate as an appetitive person takes an effort. And at one point in a later book, Plato says that we would wish divine reason to be present in all individuals, and if it isn't, it'll have to be imposed from outside. And so what he's saying is that it's really tough for a person whose desires are very powerful to be virtuous, to be moderate. If there's a trace of divine reason, and I think divine reason, going back to the Phaedrus, the Phaedo, divine reason is a human. That's what makes us humans, that we have a share in this divine reason to different degrees, to different extent. Anyways, but you know, I agree with you that there are exceptional individuals, but I don't want to be too carried away with the philosophical type. I think the philosophical type has its potential weaknesses, even vices. And you know, I think the Straussians are putting a lot of emphasis on this passage in book 7, where Glaucon says, well, listen, we're forcing these poor philosophers to do something they don't really want to do. Isn't that being unjust? And in a sense, it is. And I think that book 7 is unjust, because book 7 presents philosophers not as they presented in the earlier book, as people who have a grasp of the whole society, people who love learning. But these philosophers are maniac mathematicians. They may, you know, and those people, you want to keep them away from politics, you know, and of course Straussians are right to put those people into political. It's a disaster. But Plato does it, and I think that Plato, in spite of himself, gets carried, you know, and I think that even though books 6 and 7 are brilliant books philosophically, I think they're a disaster politically.
Okay, so more question, please, colleagues, friends, students.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please.
Hi, my name is Pavlina. I graduated from BISLA last year. But if I recall correctly, you asserted that you disagree with the claim that only philosophers are capable of being just. But if I also remember correctly, Plato stipulates, I think through Socrates, that in order to keep every citizen in their proper class, to keep philosophers in the gold class, and ensure they receive the knowledge they need to be rulers or to be just, everyone must initially be told this noble lie.
You're saying so many important things that I'm losing the sense. I mean, I have to understand what you're saying, and please keep them to us so that I could answer them, because now I thought I understood what you were saying, and now you're going to places that I don't understand. So can you please focus on the question?
Yes. Do you disagree with the practicality of Socrates' noble lie?
I believe Socrates' notion of noble lie is one of the most brilliant ideas he has, and I fully endorse it. I think about the noble lie in today's terminology as ideology, and I believe that ideology is something that we all have, all societies have, and it is necessary for social existence to have noble lies to tell us ourselves. Now, let me be specific about Plato. Plato has this sophisticated psychology that I described, okay? That there is these different parts of the soul and different individuals, different parts dominate, okay? But this is a sophisticated, Plato says, this is a sophisticated psychological theory I have about the soul. Not everyone has this sophisticated theory, but I believe that these types exist. These types exist. And the noble lie is simply to say to those people who may not have the scientific understanding of psychology that yes, there are the golden types, there are the silver types. And what he says that the metal analogy is that the gods mixed a little bit of gold in some, mixed a little bit of silver in others, mixed a little bit of bronze. And for him, I mean, you may say this is perhaps for our taste a little too conservative, but the noble lie, it has two functions. One function is to have social peace, that people accept who they are, accept their role and accept their own nature. They don't transgress their own nature and they don't transgress their role. That's one thing. But the other, if you read that noble lie to the end, there's something very interesting. He says, if it happens that an offspring of a ruler turns out to not have the character traits of a reasonable type, we should send him back among the laborers. We should give him all the respect. We should give him all the blessing. And similarly, if one of the offsprings of the working class show themselves to be talented, we should promote them. So in a sense, he's also very egalitarian. I mean, talk about the equality of opportunity. He says that at an early age, we have these tests of all people throughout society. And then if the children, and it's not very likely, but if it happens that the offspring of the rulers don't measure up to, then we demote them. We don't make them shameful. We just say, this is how you are, accept it how you are. We respect you for what you are. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I think you have a really interesting perspective on it. So thank you.
Okay,
Thank
there is a question from Hannah Arendt's room, please. Oh, yes? We cannot hear you. Just a sec. We have to solve this technical problem. We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. You are unmuted, but I guess there is a not microphone turned on.
Svetja, you have to switch microphones on the bottom where there's the mic. You have to switch it to the room mic. Béla, can I ask you a question in the meantime?
Yes, yes.
Before Hannah Arendt room connect. So we've established that the producers, the working class, can be virtuous, right? They can practice reason, but that they should abstain from ruling, right?
Well, worse than that, I think they should also refrain from political activity. They should, that to me is one of the for us, more offensive aspects of this. But you see, it's interesting because they have some craft expertise. And in a sense, they have some political weight in terms of their craft. And even though the rulers may limit production, in other words, put limits on it, upper and low, the very doing it is up to the producers. They're the ones who have full political authority over the immediate process of production. Anyways.
And see, in Slovakia, our main coalition partner, the main party in our coalition government are the common people, right? The very essence of the producers or of the working class. So what do you think Plato would warn us of when, and there's truly nothing extraordinary about the common people, no extraordinary skills, no extraordinary expertise.
Mhm.
And they are the main part of our ruling element. So what would Plato warn us of?
Well, listen, you have to tell me about this comment. Is this a populist formation? Because for me, I'm very suspicious when a political movement calls themselves the common people. That to me stinks of populism already. Okay, and already Plato would hold his nose, you know, when he hears stuff like that. Okay, but I think that Plato, even some misguided laboring people who are not really passionate populists, who are not carried away with the fatherland, with all the racist, nationalist horseshit, even then Plato says that you could be misguided. And this is my reproach to Plato. My reproach to Plato, and maybe I'm speaking from a modernist perspective, why is it not possible, Monsieur Plato, that over the life of an individual who at birth or at young age didn't show talents for philosophy and politics, over their life did do that? And for Plato to be consistent with himself, if I'm such a person, I go up to Plato and I say, Plato, listen, I am going to meet all the requirements you have. Please test me right now. And Plato, unless he was an absolute full of shit, would have to give him the test. And it's possible, maybe not likely, it's possible that this guy turns out, oh, okay, come on, be our prime minister. You know, that's what Plato would have to do. But I think Plato has this wonderful statement that the crowd cannot be philosophers, which could be understood two ways, which could be understood as say that most people cannot be philosophers, and but it could also be understood that philosophy cannot be done in a crowdy way, that a crowd, a mess of a crowd cannot come and make decent decision. In other words, philosophical discussion has to be done in a relatively small group. Mm-hmm. I have a question in the middle. I don't see anything else.
We have two questions. One is from Hannah in room. How about guys? Did you manage? Hello, Hannah in room.
Maybe you guys, if you cannot turn the speaker on, you can type it in the chat.
Okay.
Type the question.
Okay. So in the meantime, I ask Milan Valastik, our former student. Milan, your turn.
Hello, I have a question, as per usual. I was reading Plato's Republic last year at Erasmus, and I stumbled upon one very important thing. At the end of the book 7, Plato, or Socrates basically, says that we must, expel everyone from the city after which is older than age, I think it's 15. Or something like that. To start, the new tradition and justice and the way how it all should be going. And my question is, doesn't this already in certain way diminishes the possibility of ever creating a just society? Since in order to create it, you have to basically expel everyone who remembers anything differently.
Well, my short answer to that is that's one of the reasons I shun away from books 6 and 7, because I think that there are whiffs of fascism in books 6 and 7, and this is one example of it. When I read that passage for the first time, I was thinking of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot in Cambodia. That was exactly what they did to send all the citizens out of the city and keep only the young children. For me, it is the most horrible fascist idea in the Republic. And to me, I mean, I said at the beginning that Plato is a critical rationalist. He's an innovator. But I think sometimes in order to have the result that he wants, he advocates means that are totally horrible, okay? Sometimes they're not totally horrible. I think if you look at book 5, which I keep away from because I feel ambivalent towards it, because for many people say, oh, here is Plato, a woman's liberation. I mean, yes, he has some reasonable argument at the beginning of book 5 why women are by nature should not necessarily be excluded. In other words, he wants to say that even among women, we have these 3 different types. But I don't trust him. I don't trust him because I think what he wants to do in book 5 is eugenics. He wants to have a program whereby you could produce perfect children, you know. And I find that those kinds of elements in the Republic offensive. And ironically, and I mentioned to you the Straussians who believe that Plato is ironic, shows that politics doesn't mix with philosophy. I think philosophy, as he understands it in the middle books, book 6, it doesn't mix with politics. I think philosophy, as he understands it, should be as far away from politics as possible. Anyways, and once you start injecting that kind of philosophic mentality into politics, you get that kind of horrible situation. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, I think book 7, 6, and 7 undermine what I think is a profound theory of justice in book 4. So to answer your question, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Okay, Béla, well, I'm glad that Phil and colleagues here. I'm sure you would have much to say next week, Phil, about many of these things. But we have 2 questions in the chat. As it was said, the question is, there would be a universal virtue. What would be a threshold of people who would qualify to possess it?
I don't understand the term universal virtue. I never used that.
Yeah. There would be a universal virtue. As it was said, there would be or should be, what would be a threshold of people who would qualify possessing it?
I'm saying to you that whether you have virtue or not depends on whether you manage to have a proper balance of your soul within your soul of the different elements that are in potential conflict, in potential tension. So the threshold would be the measure you are able to impose on the different aspects of your soul.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the second question, yes. Yeah. Second question is, it was mentioned that a just city cannot be too rich. What all other boundaries? What all other boundaries for a just city?
Well, I mean, that's a question that the rulers have to decide depending on the given situation. But Plato's argument is this, that if a city acquires too much wealth, it will be vulnerable to attack from others. And he would say also that a city that is too preoccupied by producing wealth is less preoccupied by ordering itself properly, and it's less preoccupied by defending itself properly. In other words, a city that is overproducing wealth is going to become a soft city. Soft is going to be vulnerable to attacks, both because people will want its wealth and because it's so concentrated on producing wealth that it doesn't have any other resources to defend itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, another question. Thank you, Béla.
Michal Kovac was first to raise his hand.
Yes, please.
Hello, I am Michael. I haven't read it, Plato, but I wanted to ask you. You mentioned that Plato mentioned that those souls would be in city in a kind of balance. Don't you think that Plato also mentioned well, did he mention that in times, for example, war or some other catastrophic, would some virtues be just better, to rise up above others, or like a job for napríklad Sparta city that existed also at some time, kind of critique?
Well, I'm not sure I understood your question. Are you saying, or are you asking what happens to virtues and the balance within a city in case of war? Well,
Yes,
I think the
that
situation.
some virtues simply rise above others.
Can I finish? I think that first of all, a situation of war is already a potentially unjust situation. It's something to be avoided. And I think to an unjust situation, you have to have an unjust response. And the unjust response would be the rule by the military. In other words, in those situations, what is much more important than anything else is to be a fierce and ruthless fighter, okay? Which is not a great virtue. I mean, having the capacity to do it is a virtue, you see? But I think that engaging, at least in the Republic, in some other ancient documents, and also I think in Aristotle, being engaged in war brings out a very valuable, important characteristic of human beings. I don't think Plato in the Republic sees it that way, but I don't know if I answered your question. Did I answer your question? Did I understand?
Yeah, I think you did.
Okay, Elvis, please.
Hi, Béla. Could you please once again elaborate on Plato's argument on poetry and art?
Well, I think that Plato's attitude to poetry and art is very far from us. And I think from a poetic and artistic point of view, Plato's attitude is very vulgar and crass, okay? He was not really interested, mainly. I think he speaks about poetry being pleasant, but I think he's somewhat contemptuous of it. My view is that Plato is enraged about what poetry has done, because, and this is a historical fact, that the educational model in ancient Greece, in pre-classical Greece, was poetry. Homer, Hesiod, these were not just simply providing pleasure, but these were the models for educating people. You followed them in order to lead your life the best possible. And Plato thinks that this is outmoded, that these paradigms of education should be rejected. So his attack on poetry, I think, is not so much motivated by his insensitivity to art, which may have existed, but is more motivated by his great preoccupation with education. And he doesn't see poetry and art in any other terms than as a bad educating device. And he sees it as a competition, his own educational ideas. And that's why I think he's a critical rationalist. He doesn't want to go as far as sophism, although it sometimes comes closer to sophism in their attack on tradition. Sometimes there's certain elements in him, but he wants to retrieve the traditional heroic virtues in a new, modern, rational form. And I think he sees poetry as an obstacle to that.
Thank you for clarifying.
Well, if we had more time, we would tell you, and then the rest, what quarrel we had with Béla yesterday on this issue. But that we will leave for now. but let's talk. Let's ask Lucas Zibela to have his question.
Hello, my name is Lucas, and I have a question. Is it possible to transfer from being as an individual being just to unjust by changing or losing the virtue, as you mentioned?
Well, I think I wouldn't put it into those terms. I think we could put it in more Platonic terms, which is to say, you're just if your soul is in balance. Okay, if your different dispositions, talents, character traits are working in harmony. Now you become unjust when one of these overpowers the others. Okay, and I think you could become unjust because of your appetite. You become a pig, you become a sex maniac. You can become unjust because of your spirit. You become a crazed, a valor crazed individual. But I think you could become unjust as a reasonable person, becoming too rational, where your reason dominates the others, your sense of shame, your sense of your body, and I think today, those fanatic people who do this regime of dieting, of this regime of exercising, this is to me an insult and an assault on the appetitive part, and it's in a form. I think it's a form of injustice to the body, and certainly it is in excess.
Can I ask?
Hey, hi.
Hello, I'm Cole. Do you think?
I know you, Cole.
Yes. Well, I thought I would, follow the formality. Do you think that Plato thinks that you can be too just, or is that your view instead of his?
No, I don't think. I think being too doesn't make sense. You're either just or you're not. I think that what I was saying is that it is easier for some people to be just than for others, but I think everybody is just in exactly the same sense. Everybody is just depending on their main character traits if they have a balance among their different character traits. That's what justice is. And I think to be too reasonable is being unjust, yes. Too passionate is being.
I might have misspoke, but my question was whether or not Plato thinks that you can be too rational. I might have said too just. Can you be too rational? Can your reason, by being too reasonable, can you be unjust?
Yeah. I think that's a very, to me, a troubling question, because I think that certainly there are passages in Plato where he would say, there is no limit to rational. The more rational you are, the juster you are. So, but I think there's also passages in Plato where he has a healthy respect for the body and a healthy respect for the desires of the body. Okay, so I cannot give you a definite answer, and my answer to you is again, I come back to my fragmentarian reading of the Republic. That I think that Plato has his better moments and he has his worst moments. And his worst moment, he is an extreme rationalist. In his better moments, he's a critical rationalist, where reason is critical of itself, where reason is able to monitor itself and restrain itself. To be really just as a reasonable person is to put correct self-correction on your reason.
Actually, I had, because no one is raising hands, but please do. I had a similar question. You also mentioned that, for example, communists were overly rational. That I'm not sure, but doesn't matter. Maybe Phil, could you have a take on this? Whether the too rational, whether there is some kind of what Béla is saying, that the too rational might be also a problem, not necessarily wise, but a problem. What do you think?
It's a vice, and I want to repeat, Samko, that I think communism is the vice of reason. And I mean, if you think about communist planning, that I think if you think about the Khmer Rouge, it was not their appetite, it was not their passion, it was their reason that drove them to those horrible things. And Stalinism is not like fascism, driven by passion, a passionate hatred of the other. It is a passion of reason. Stalinism was a hyper-rational aberration. That's how I believe it.
Well, it was more kind of a thugs around.
No. But don't talk about persons. Talk about the ideal of it. What communism had a great idea, but it over-rationalized it, and as a result, it went to shit. That's my view. In other words, the excess of communism is the excess of reason.
Phil?
Again, just top of mind. I would say I agree with what Béla says, and just give maybe the most basic, crude example that ties into some of the things that were said earlier is, when you look at the proposal for the regime in the Republic, with an emphasis on, how do you create unity? How do you create cohesion? How do you create fellow feeling within this regime? In a way, it's a very crude instrumental rationality, means and ends. If this is what you want to achieve, this is the way to do it. So we want to achieve unity. So what do? We abolish private property, we abolish the family. Even, to come back to what Béla described as the most extreme version of this, kick everyone over 10 years old out of the city. It's a horrible thing, but if you think of politics in purely instrumental reasoning, then sure, this is the end you want to achieve. You want to get rid of prejudices. How do you do that? You get rid of all the people who past a certain age will have developed these prejudices, whether it be, take your pick, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, right? This is a generation that's already been perverted. So what do? We re-educate them in some way. We get rid of them. So all that to say, I agree with Béla that the worst moments in Plato are the moments of extreme rationalism, because I think one thing that the Republic shows is, what would a fully rational political system look like?
Yeah.
And this is what it would involve.
Phil, can I say something? I don't know if you will agree with this, but I believe that there is a difference between the early books and the middle books, because I think in the early books, you have private property, you have family, you have physical pleasure. And the philosopher of the earlier books is, the bar is much lower. Philosopher of the earlier book is someone who has a grasp of the whole situation, someone who is engaged in reasonable discourse, who's open to new ideas. It doesn't have this oppressive hyper-rationality of the middle books, you see. And we could talk about Sicily, because I'm, in my mind, part of the reason, and then of course I'm psychologizing here, part of the reason is that he tried to rationalize his failure in Sicily, okay? Because if you look at the failure in Sicily, I think it's as much Plato's fault as Dionysius II's fault. I think he was under the influence of Pythagoreans, Archytas, who he met just around this. He's beginning to introduce these horseshit Pythagorean ideas into politics. And no wonder that Dionysius II says, fuck you, I'm not interested in this shit. And it's interesting that the father is the one who invited Plato, Dionysius I. And I think he invited Plato on the basis of the Proto-Republic, the earlier version, okay, which was a sensible, somewhat conservative, of course, congenial to a tyrant who is more or less wants to do a decent, you see. But I think by the second and third visit with the young Dionysius II, I think he was off the rails. Plato was off the rails, and I think it's both wonderful and it's a shame that we have books 6, 7, along with the other books. It should have been a different book by itself. And I think it's a different book. It's really a book about philosophy. It's more about who are the true philosophers, okay? And once you go into this question, who are the true philosophers? You see, Phil, I talked about potestas and potentia. It's one of the challenges, and I think the philosopher king, this notion of the philosopher king, is an attempt to bring together the two, is to bring together the philosophic soul of the earlier books, this harmonious soul, with political power. And the question is, how do people who have this balance in their soul, who are just in the Platonic sense, acquire political power over people, over a city, over a government? And I think Plato has this very, very easy and cheap answer. Well, let's bring the two together. And it's kind of an artificial, he never really explains the transition, how we could get to that. He never really explains that. But that's another question. That's another question.
Okay, well, we are coming to the close, so we have 2 more questions, and then there is one that will deserve the whole session about poetry. So let's Tomáš Volek, let's wait for that. It would be one of the last discussion, and we will devote to that the whole session. So let's keep it. So let's have some other people. If anyone still wants to pose a question before we finish. Clarification about potesta and potentia or whatever.
I had a sort of clarifying question about this inner power, and to be honest, I thought maybe I understood, but I don't know if I understand the distinction between inner and outer power and its relation to justice.
Well, the inner and external. External power is power over. Power in a sense of being at the top of a hierarchy, okay? External power. It's transcendent power, whereas potentia is immanent power, is internal power, which is to say the power to act internally, okay? And true freedom is not having potestas. That's the Thracian view. True freedom, according to Plato, Socrates, is to have inner potential, the power to act. But then, of course, the question has to arise, are these two modes of power absolutely distinct? Then they cannot be absolutely distinct, because it's possible that someone who has inner power, and I think the desirability of politics is that people who have this inner power have also the external power, and that's the dream of the Republic. And I think the philosopher king supposed to be the answer to that. The philosopher king is the one who combines these two senses of power. And it's true that the true harmonious society is run by those who have this external power along with their internal power.
So that helps a lot. And does it map onto this like distinction between justice being a reward in itself, injustice being a punishment in itself? That would be like internal. And then the rewards and punishments that are attached to justice by the city would be the external.
Yes, I would say that. I think you see, that goes back to Glaucon's challenge. Glaucon says, show us that justice is beneficial in and of itself without its consequences. That's a bit misleading, because it has to have consequences for the individual. So I think he collapses two senses of consequences. Consequences for the city. In other words, what he wants to move away from is that you're just in order to have recognition from the city. That's one set of consequences which he wants to say, we don't want you to justify justice in that sense. We know that people are just to look just, but we want you to explain why people should be just, even though they aren't recognized as being just. Okay, and that's a kind of consequence, but it's a consequence internally. So, anyways, Cole, does that help?
Okay. The last questions, anyone?
I have a question, but about these sessions, not necessarily about Plato's Republic.
About what?
About what?
About the sessions.
Yes.
Is next session going to be at BISLA, or is it online still?
Oh, no. We will study at BISLA face to face, except those Wednesdays, Wednesday discussion, because all of the speakers are in North America.
Okay.
Either in Canada or United States, and then Phil Azzi will be next Wednesday. The difference will be that you could come here and then watch the debates in one of the rooms, and then afterwards we have a glass of wine, Paulina. So
okay, thank you.
I don't know whether you are in the Netherlands or in Bratislava. So come and watch it here somewhere, not in a crowded room like people in the Hannah Arendt, and then we will have a glass of wine, and it will be wonderful to see you.
Okay, I'll bring Dominic too.
Yes, and a bottle of wine too. Don't worry. Okay, guys. Well, Béla, many thanks for your.
Well, thank you guys. I really enjoyed it, and I think that I had some really good questions. Really.
Yes. Well, you are at BISLA and part of BISLA, so you know that we continue. This was basically your course for maybe 7-8 years.
Yeah, that's right.
and I'm sure you will be back soon. But thanks a lot. But the good news is that Phil Azzi will be next week, and you will have Béla Egyed chirping in here and there if there won't be any questions. So it continues, and as I said, those who are in Bratislava, come over. We'll be in the rose semaphore zone, and which you don't understand in Canada, but we do. And we would be allowed to be at the garden and be together outside. So we will continue next Wednesday. Any word about the next week, Phil?
What I'd like to do, and I haven't worked it out completely in my mind, but I would like, and it was there often, usually in the background in Béla's talk, and he brought it to the forefront a few times. I'd like to talk about the notion of the regime as an authoritative framework in the Republic, and perhaps more generally. The different types of regimes, how do you construct a regime? What should be the goals of the good regime? Just it's not a topic that we talk about very much, at least not here in Canada anymore, about the fundamental framework of a political community, the authoritative framework, what we would call the values, the goals and objectives. But I think it's something I would like to touch on, because I think it's always there in the Republic. And in fact, as you know, the title, which we translate as Republic, is actually Politeia. The title is literally the regime or the constitution. So it's always there, and that's what I would like to touch on.
And in Slovak or Czech, of course, it's translated as constitution. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Béla. I'm sorry that you are not here, because after talk, one would want to have a after discussion talk and chit chat, but we will talk on perhaps on Sunday. Thank you, all of you.
Can I say something, please?
Absolutely.
Elvis, please give my best to your parents, okay? I hope they're doing well.
Okay.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that, Elvis.
Yeah.
I have very fond memory of your parents. Tell them that. I have pictures even with them.
Yeah, well, in the next room here. Yeah. Listen, and we were drinking Armagnac, by the way.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
So thanks a lot, all those students who are the graduates of BISLA. I'm very glad that you tune in. And I'm also very glad that quite a number of those students who will be students next semester, and then you posed very good questions. So we are looking forward to your contribution, and of course our other students. But this was the session for our Plato class, and I hope it inspired you to read the first book, and then we'll meet on Monday at 2:30 at BISLA in the garden, discussing the first book, and then have a nice evening and take care. Bye bye.